This one has been around a long, long time. And he's the expert, I would say, on exposing falsehoods and revealing the truths, especially in the 911. James H. Fetzer, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Andy and Tim. It's a delight to be here. Yeah. I've been at this 9/11 thing for a long time. I founded Scholars for 9/11 Truth in December of 2005. And when Alex had his American Scholars Conference in June of 2006, he invited me to give the keynote lecture. I've been flown around the world to give talks about 9/11, and I still care about it profoundly because it was a pivotal turning point in American history. It was designed to do that. And alas, because so many of the consequences have been deleterious, negative, and wrong, I regret that it was such a success. So what I'm going to present is 9/11 Revisited. Who was responsible and why? You can flip, or I think maybe I can. No, I was a sign. You want me to turn?
Yeah, I can do the slides if you want. So yeah, as Jim was saying, 9/11 Revisited and who was responsible and why. Jim Fetzer, PhD, founder, Scholars for 9/11 Truth, 18 May 25.
Yeah, amazingly enough, on 9/11, they just happened to have video at hand showing Palestinians rejoicing as though it were concurrent with what was taking place there. But in fact, it was pure propaganda. The Palestinian people had nothing to do with it. I was certain at the time that this was archival footage from some prior religious or political holiday, and indeed it turned out to be the case. But it's symptomatic, not to reveal the bottom line, of Israeli ops that they blame the Palestinians. For example, Surin was, by no coincidence, a Palestinian when Bobby was taken out. And I believe the role of Israel in his assassination was more substantial by far than in the assassination of his brother, John. Next. Then we had the 19 Islamic terrorists who could have not even flown any of the aircraft involved here. Hani Hanjour is supposed to have piloted Flight 77 into the Pentagon, performing a spiral loop to come in at just barely skimming the ground at over 400 miles an hour. Couldn't even pilot a simple Cessna. It was all nonsense. And even though some of them made contact with their families after the event, such as Mohammed Atta, called his father to tell him he was alive, but he was petrified, afraid they were going to track him down to kill him, because they were merely patsies who had nothing to do with the actual event except being set up for that role. The government has never changed. In fact, that it turns out to be a practice of the American government. Once they take a position about JFK, 9/11, whatever, they're locked in and will never change. There's no rationality or science about it. It's pure politics. Next. Next slide is good. Thus, as this not a shred of evidence any of the 9/11 hijackers boarded any of the planes. It was really embarrassing, as Greg McKee was making an observation about it here. Not only that, but as the next slide shows, the CIA was responsible for getting the visas for what appear to have been 200 Israeli Mossad operatives who were brought in under the guise of being art students. Next slide, yeah. So the whole thing was really an elaborate Israeli op. They had communication facilities. They were telling people not to come in. I had a little old lady from Brooklyn tell me that her rabbi told the members of her synagogue not to go into Lower Manhattan that day. She wanted to let me know. I think of all those who died, perhaps one Jew died on 9/11, not more. It was carefully contrived. In fact, they made it so elaborate in how it was actually conducted that it would be extraordinarily difficult to sort out, just as in the assassination of JFK. They spent more time on the cover-up than they did on the assassination itself. Next. They even made, they blamed Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden turns out to have been an officer in the CIA, too. Tim Osman. And he was visited in a hospital in Dubai shortly before his death of his medical maladies on 15 December 2001. It's tough to get dialysis machines in and out of those caves in Afghanistan. Here, as I wrote about a film made about his alleged death 10 years after, because Barack Obama resuscitated him to have him die in Pakistan to position himself for a triumphal re-election as the man who got the most wanted man in the world. A film that may even take the Academy Award for Best Picture of 2012 raises serious moral issues, glorifies a political stunt that is based on an historical fiction, and it is the latest in Obama propaganda. Osama bin Laden was not killed on 2 May 2011 during the raid on a compound in Pakistan. He actually died in Afghanistan on or about 15 December 2001 and was buried there in an unmarked grave. Local obituaries reported Osama's death at the time. Even Fox and CNN as well on the 26th of December reported he had died, buried in an unmarked grave as mentioned, in accordance with Muslim tradition. He did not die in Pakistan. Nick Holstrom, the celebrated historian of science from the UK, is the leading expert on the 7/7 subway attacks, has published about it. Osama bin Laden, 2057-2001. David Ray Griffin even published a book about it, Osama bin Laden, Dead or Alive. It was an elaborate charade. Here you can find Nick's article about it on my blog at jameshfetzer.org to this day. Next. So what we were told was all completely false, completely fabricated, totally misleading. Next slide, please. Yes. And remember, when we asked the Taliban to turn Osama over to the United States for trial, they said they'd be glad to do that if we had any proof that Osama had been involved in 9/11. We never produced the proof. They never turned him over. And of course, we couldn't produce the proof because he had nothing to do with it. Next slide. Now we take a look, this followed the dissolution of the Soviet Union, very close proximity, which was followed by a whole lot of propaganda. You can go to the next slide, a whole lot of propaganda from the neocons who had this project for a new American century. But the plot was based upon Israeli sources. Bibi Netanyahu, Ehud Olmert devised the plan. They even published about terrorism before the notion was widespread in the West, how the West can win. It was a setup to draw American forces into the Middle East to take out the modern Arab state that served as a counterbalance Israel's domination of the entire region. Next. Here are key players, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, who wanted to create a dominant American hegemony expanded to the Middle East, but really were devoted Zionists, Jewish supremacists, who wanted this to happen for the benefit of Israel. Next. Thus, we had the declaration that this is something that can happen if America gets engaged in the Middle East, but that it may take a while, given the dissolution of the Soviet Union, for American leaders to put the pieces together and realize that's what they should do. So he published The Process of Transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, again, to create an American empire that would endure the next 100 years, which was all a figment. No. Stay there. Is unlikely to occur unless there is some traumatic event like a new Pearl Harbor. So, of course, when it all went down, we heard a whole lot about a new Pearl Harbor. Wesley Clark would eventually reveal what he learned at the Pentagon when he visited shortly after 9/11. He encountered a general there who told him that there was a plan now to attack Iraq. And they both thought that was very strange because Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. He came back about a month later and asked him, are we still planning to attack Iraq? And he said, oh, no, sir. Come into my office. He said, we just got a memorandum from Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. And Clark asked, is it classified? He said, oh, yes, sir. Well, then don't show it to me. Just tell me about it. He said, well, we now have a plan to take out the governments of 7 countries in the next 5 years, including Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, eventually Syria, and confronting the Persian nation of Iran. And they both were puzzled. And Clark said, well, what is this all about? And the general said, well, I don't know. I guess we're just good at it, because they had nothing to do with 9/11. Next. Now, yeah, you can skip. Here we have a flight plan for the 4 different flights. And let me just explain. None of these 4 flights actually crashed as advertised. 2 weren't even in the air. The other 2 was still in the air after they'd officially crashed. The security at all 4 at the different airports was all run by ICTS, which is coincidentally an Israeli firm. Next. And if we go to Shanksville, for example, as the next slide shows, we'll see there's a hole in the ground, but it's a pretty modest dimension. It's only like about 15 or 20 feet by 10. We're talking about an airplane that has a 125-foot wingspan, has a tail that stands 40 feet above the ground. And in fact, there is no sign of any plane having crashed there. Next. Here you see real plane crashes in Missouri, Amsterdam, Russia. You had massive amounts of fuselage, big chunks, all kinds of bodies, luggage. Shanksville, none of the above. I don't even believe that smoke was there. That appears to have been added on. That appears to have been a retouched photograph using Photoshop. Next. Here, Richard Kanicki, first reporter on the scene, was interviewed, and like another reporter said, the eerie aspect of the crash site was there was no sign any plane had crashed there. And of course, the explanation is because no plane had crashed there. Continue. Next. Yeah. So what happened to the plane? Well, the claim was made. I mean, it was absurd at the time that the passengers had commandeered the plane, that they had actually flipped upside down and it had disappeared into an abandoned mine shaft. Well, this was ludicrous. We know what to do with miners who are trapped in abandoned mine shafts. We break out the light 24/7 to save their life and to hope by a miracle someone would have survived. That did not happen at Shanksville. No lights, no heavy equipment, no effort even to regain the passenger bodies because, of course, if they dug it up, there was nothing to find. Next. There was this photograph. A woman claimed on the left, you see that there was a sign of the plane crash, but the kind of smoke was wrong. On the right, you see the dark smoke from a plane crash, in the middle from an explosion. This was an explosion set up, and oddly enough, this may also be Photoshop because it was over a pond, which was not even the proper location. So they were manufacturing evidence to sell us a song and dance. Next. Yeah. Here you see a real plane crash We didn't have anything like that at Shanksville. Continue. Turns out that Flight 93 was still in the air. This is Pilots for 9/11 Truth. By tracing air-ground communication, they established Flight 93 was still in the air and over Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, after it had officially crashed in Shanksville. Stunning stuff. Pilots have made great contribution to the study of 9/11. Next. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, even though it's the most surveilled building in the world, they have literally hundreds of video cameras. They only released 5 frames, 4 of which you see here. Now, notice in the upper left, that frame is conveniently labeled plane. You're going to have to strain to see it, but just above the gate mechanism, there's a white plume coming from a plane, which pilots and aeronautical engineers have explained could not have been from a commercial jet aircraft or even a military. That would have been dark, but could have been from a missile fired into the building. Then you see the flame pattern, which doesn't even appear to have been real, as well, as we're going to discover. Next slide. So I asked a friend, Jack White, if he could introduce the image of a 757 in Shanksville, and the Pentagon. We're supposed to be dealing with 757s in New York, with 767s, which are considerably larger, scaled to the same size as the tail. And notice it's over twice as large. This was not a 757. It appears to have been an unmanned aerial vehicle, a Global Hawk, that actually fired a missile into the building. Next. And when you look at the hit point, it's about 10 feet high, 16, 17 feet wide. There's this, steel fence, link fence. You got a couple cars, a couple big spools of cable. You got unbroken windows, by the way, around the hit point. What you don't have is a massive pile of aluminum debris from a 100-ton airliner. No bodies, no seats, no luggage, no wings, no tail, because no plane crashed there either. Next. Here you have the collapse that only took place 45 minutes later. A section of the wall. I think what happened there on the facade of the building is Rumsfeld, looking at what he saw, he didn't think it looked impressive enough, so he brought down a part of the building. Continue. When you look at when they did the excavation of that part of the building, however, there are no signs of the fires that we saw in those frames. In fact, even on the 3rd floor there, you can see, if you look carefully, what appears to be a wooden desk for an Oxford Unabridged Dictionary. But just notice, no signs of any fire having occurred there. And I believe, in fact, that's because no fire did occur there. Next. So what's supposed to have happened? This plane is supposed to have come in skimming the ground at over 400 miles an hour, hitting on that ground floor location where there was no debris whatsoever. But 2 key points. Had this plane actually arrived this way, it would have torn up the ground. Yet the Pentagon lawn, as we're going to see, is perfectly clear and unblemished. Impossible had the official narrative been true. Second, a Boeing 757 at over 400 miles an hour couldn't get closer than 60 or even 80 feet to the ground because of a phenomenon known as downdraft. It's a physically and aerodynamically impossible event that we were sold. Next. Here you see the 2 civilian lime green fire trucks that happened to be in the vicinity at the time, putting out the very modest fires. And notice the lawn, completely unblemished, bereft of any debris, which would only show up about 45 minutes later, not here. If you want further confirmation, the next slide, this is from a BBC documentary on 9/11. You'll see no debris, no debris. Here's another from the BBC. The next slide. You'll see again, no debris. And this is even now after that section of the building had collapsed. So where's the plane? Next slide. Theory Masonic. Yeah, there was this fascinating piece of debris showing up later. But what's noticeable about it, it is from a 757. It looks like it was peeled off. It doesn't look like it was the result of a violent collision where it all be crumbled. Plus, there are no signs that it was exposed to any intense fire. So those are two tells, but the third is most important. Look there. This appears to be a chunk of a vine not indigenous to the Arlington, Virginia area. Continue. Next slide. There you see a close-up of the vine. Now, a retired attorney by the name of James Hansen from Columbus, Ohio, realized 757s have a wonderful safety record. They very rarely crash. He was able to track this to a crash near Cali, Colombia, as the next slide shows. That happened in 1995, where the pilots lost track and crashed into the side of the mountain while passing through a jungle where these vines grow in abundance. American Airlines 965. And guess what? As the next slide may or may not show, the salvage was done by an Israeli firm. So I just happen to have this piece of debris they could put on the Pentagon lawn. How about that? How convenient. Next slide. Now, I suggested when the BBC came to interview me for the first in their Conspiracy Files series that the debris had been dropped from a C-130 that was circling the Pentagon. So I went and asked the pilot. They said, is it possible you dropped debris on the Pentagon line? He said, it was absurd. He didn't say it was false. He said it was absurd. But I felt it was just too awkward to have officers and men bringing the debris out directly onto the lawn and believe to this day that it was dropped by the 130. Next. Here's the official trajectory as opposed to when it came out as circular, it had a straight on and it hit a series of stationary lamp posts. Now, by Newton's third law, the effect of a stationary lamp post being hit by a plane traveling over 400 miles an hour is the same as if the plane had been stationary, hit by lamp posts at traveling over 400 miles an hour. They would have ripped open the wings. It would have mixed with air, would have burst into flame. You would have cartwheeled across the lawn. We would have had debris everywhere, but we had debris nowhere. Therefore, a plane traveling over 400 miles an hour did not hit this series of lampposts. That's more. Another detail of a very tall tale. Next. Meanwhile, there were witnesses at a Citgo station. It was right in here, a Citgo station, who saw a plane approach the building, but it was on the wrong side of the Citgo station. Officially, it should have been on the other. Here, the straight line trajectory. So they have a contradiction here in what happened. And it turns out that a friend of mine from JFK Research by the name of Roy Schaefer had a buddy who was a trucker, Dave Ball, who happened to be in front of the Pentagon at the time. And Dave Ball told Roy how he saw a plane fly toward the Pentagon and then swerve over it. At the same time, an explosion took place. And Roy told me he couldn't understand why Dave still thought a plane had hit the building when he saw it swerve over. I told Roy, I said, look, we got to get Dave on the air. Get him on my show here. Roy came because he'll be safer if he tells his story. And Roy tried to convince him, but Dave refused to do it. And the next thing we knew, he was found dead in an abandoned building. Now, you can't quite see it here, but in the C ring, there was this hole, which is surprisingly symmetrical, and they forgot to list what spray painted their punch out. This was another way of fabricating the evidence. By the way, since this was supposed to have been created by a wheel assembly at an angle, it should not have been so symmetrical had it been real. But in fact, it was done by cordite, a military explosive. They punched it out to make it look as though it were real. Next slide. Here's Jamie McIntyre. This guy was CNN's best reporter on the scene live that day. He was asked by the anchor about the plane crashing into the Pentagon. He said, well, from my close-up inspection, there's no sign of any plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon. The only small pieces of material you can find in your hands And that's because the Global Hawk is made out of synthetic material and went after firing its missile into the building, into the West Wing, where Donald Rumsfeld had all the experts on budget come together with all the evidence about a missing 2.3 trillion he'd announced the day before. All killed, evidence wiped out, pure coincidence, of course. Jamie McIntyre was at a loss, but there he was, a witness right on the scene reporting no plane hit the building. But he did pick up the residue of what he did not know at the time was a Global Hawk, an unmanned aerial vehicle. Next. Here we have April Gallup. She was a civilian who worked in the Pentagon, and she brought her infant son into work that day. She said when she first touched her computer to turn it on, there was a massive explosion. I imagine that was a coincidence. Blew a huge hole in the wall. She stepped out and she saw no signs of any aircraft, no parts, no wings, no tail, no luggage, but she did smell explosive residue. Next. Yeah. Here we have General Albert Stubblebine, who was at one time the head of all U.S. military SIG intelligence, which includes photographic. In other words, he was an expert in the interpretation of photos, giving an interview in Germany, where he told the reporter it was easy to tell no plane had hit the Pentagon because the facade has limestone bricking, and it's a very soft, porous stone that would have shown the imprint. So he was speaking with confidence, no plane had hit the Pentagon. Now, subsequently, in the course of my research, I would do an interview with General Stubblebine about how two of the planes weren't even in the air that day, 11 and 77 North Tower in the Pentagon, and the other two, all four of the crash sites had been fabricated or faked, albeit in different ways. And the general not only agreed with me, but gave additional reasons why I was right. Next. Well, later in the afternoon, there's all this billowing black smoke coming up, so that members of Congress coming out of the building, out of the Capitol, looked across the Potomac and they saw this billowing black smoke, and I wondered what in the world. Because remember those lime green fire trucks, you could see one in the foreground there, had already put out the very modest fires. Well, it was coming from a series of enormous dumpsters in front of the Pentagon. In fact, a member of Scholars for 9/11 Truth would come visit me in Duluth later in the year and show me 44 slides he had from a National Geographic special, apparently, where you could actually see all the gap between the dumpsters where the fires were raging in the building. They weren't even fires from the Pentagon itself. It was that bad. This was basically a made-for-TV movie to which we were subjected, for which there's ample additional proof. Continue. Yes, thank you. And get this. Edward Hendry had the presence of mind to know that the Bureau of Transportation Statistics keeps records on every commercial carrier, what time it's supposed to be scheduled to take off, what time it actually takes off, wheels up, wheels down, whole bit. They keep those and publish them for every commercial flight in the United States. But guess what? No American Airlines Flight 77, that's the Pentagon, was scheduled to port Washington Dulles on 9/11. That plane was not even in the air. Next. And again, Thierry Masson, a French intellectual, had it right. He and his son put up a web, Hunt the Boeing, where we were supposed to look from all the photographs at the Pentagon for the Boeing aircraft, the 757 that's supposed to have hit the building, and there's no evidence whatsoever. So Thierry got it right. No plane hit the Pentagon. Next. Turning to the Twin Towers, they were magnificent. Construction began 1966. They were actually opened 1980. They had a very clever tube within a tube design, won all kinds of awards for architecture and engineering. If you go to the next slide, you'll see there was the inner tube with a massive 47 core columns and then 230 external steel support columns connected by steel trusses that would be filled with 4 to 8 inches of concrete. The variance being because they had V-shaped grooves that were 4 inches deep. So in some areas of concrete would be only 4, in other areas 8 inches. Because the building were 280 feet on a side, that meant each floor of the World Trade Center of the Twin Towers was an acre of concrete on a steel truss. Next. And in fact, the amount of steel involved varied enormously. It was 6 inches thick at the bottom, then 5, 4, going up all the way to be only like a quarter of an inch at the top. So the amount of mass of the steel for the topmost floors was dramatically less than that for lower floors. And may I point out that John Skilling, who was the head of engineering for the design team, the engineering firm that built the tower, said that each floor had a safety factor of 20, meaning it could carry 20 times its expected dead load or live, the difference being whether you got people, computers, tables, chairs, office furniture there or not. The idea of the building's collapse was a physical absurdity. Continue. There were, of course, altogether 7 different buildings. We had the 2 Twin Towers, but we also had others, including Building 7, which is the red here, which would only come down at 5:20 in the afternoon, 7 hours after the destruction of the North Tower. They had a problem with bringing it down. It was so robust in its construction. I'll add comments as we proceed. Next. Now, there was a massive asbestos problem. They had used asbestos in the towers in the original construction, but now the EPA had directed it had to be removed. Well, that created a major problem. They couldn't destroy the Twin Towers by a conventional demolition because it would have exposed all the asbestos and other heavy metals to the atmosphere. They couldn't do it with scaffolding by removing it physically because it would have been such an expensive project, about $1 billion a year. However, it would be extraordinarily convenient if there were a terrorist attack that just came down and just happened to take them both out, as of course would ensue as events would develop. Next. So here we have the after. It's as though all and only buildings with WTC designation would be destroyed that day. Absolutely stunning, very thorough, very comprehensive. And here is where Building 7 used to be. Building 1 here, Building 2 here. Continue. Now, the transfer from the public ownership to private was directed by the Port Authority of New York. For Frank Lowry, Paul Eisenberg, Ron Lauder were all Zionist Jews who transferred it to the Silverstein properties, where Larry Silverstein just happened to be a personal friend of Bibi Netanyahu. They spoke every Sunday. So Silverstein Properties took control of the World Trade Center just 6 weeks before the event. He fired the security term that had been looking after the building since it first opened in 1970, hired an Israeli team in its place, and redid his insurance policy to include a terrorist clause so that in the event, because there were 2 planes, he claimed 2 attacks, double indemnity. He pocketed $4.5 billion on a $114 million investment. They don't call him Lucky Larry for nothing. Next. There he is, Larry Silverstein himself. Now, he and his daughter, who worked in the World Trade Center, every morning would have dinner at Windows on the World, a restaurant atop the North Tower. That morning, however, Larry and his daughter were no-shows. He would subsequently claim that his wife had made a dermatology appointment for him. In any case, he was nowhere to be found on 9/11. Next. Here was the Kroll. This was a company, the Israeli company they hired for security. It's really quite striking what took place here, how the whole op was controlled by Israeli or Zionist personnel throughout from beginning to end. Next slide. Plus, there was Odago. This was a messenger service. It turns out Willie Brown even confirmed that he'd been warned not to fly on 9/11. He didn't want to identify who had warned him, but it turned out to be Condoleezza Rice. So Odago was notifying anyone who was Jewish who worked in the World Trade Center not to come in that day. And as I've observed already, no more than one Jew died on 9/11. Next. Yeah, hold it up. Next slide. Yeah, there we go. So this was Donald Rumsfeld the day before saying the 2.3 trillion was missing. Now, you see, normally an experienced politician would know better than to have a big story early in the week, because as the days go by, the story grows and it gains legs, as it is said. Ordinarily, you leave a big story for, say, a Friday just before a weekend. He was doing this on a Monday. And as I have said, he therefore directed the section chief to bring all the records and all these experts into the West Wing, where they would be taken out by the missile fired in to destroy the evidence related to the missing trillions. And by the way, the controller of the Pentagon at the time, the chief financial officer, was Dov Zakheim, who is not only Jewish, but even a rabbi, and who had a remote control company. So they had mechanism for taking over aircraft, where I believe the original plan was to use remotely controlled planes to hit the North and the South Tower, until they discovered that the construction was so robust that no real planes could actually enter the building, and they had to devise an alternative plan. Next. This is Dov Zakheim himself, who had that company and who, one dare say, played a role in missing the 2.3 trillion. I wonder where the money went. Next. Now, in the North Tower, we had a plane crash, very odd situation. There just happened to be a French film crew there known as the Naudet brothers. And when you consider that when you hear the sound of a plane, it's already a great deal distance away because the plane is traveling faster than the speed of sound. Yet the cameraman here, hearing a sound that would have come from way behind us, nevertheless swung his camera up just in time to capture the impact of what was purporting to be Flight 11 on the North Tower. Next slide. Here you see what a real 767 approaching the North Tower would have looked like, but instead, if you flip to the next, you'll see what we actually got on the screen, which Rosalie Grable, known on the internet as the Web Fairy, looked like a series of flying pigs. The whole thing was a complete scam because the Naudet brothers turns out to be an anagram for Duane Street, which is where they were located. In other words, they have ways of telling the world, if you know how to read the signs, that this is totally fraudulent. A fellow named Raphael from Scotland observed that in order for them to have been in the right position at the right time, they had to satisfy over 100 improbable circumstances indicating they were not there by chance. Next. Here you see the moment of the alleged hit. Notice it kind of looks pretty much horizontal, right? It's actually going to turn out the blade was on an angle, hitting on an angle, according to what we see from the effects to the facade. Go to the next slide. And you'll see initially, even after that, was like a Z, elongated Z, but then it turned out to a V. And get this, they even extended the length of the right end of the tail of the wing. If you go to the next slide, it was elongated, which is even more implausible. I mean, you're talking about very robust external steel support columns. No real plane could have penetrated through. They would have crumbled external to the building. But yet we have these cookie cutter-like cutouts where Judy Wood compared them to the Wile E. Coyote cartoons, where you get a perfect outline of Wile E. Coyote as he passes through a boulder. This was not a bona fide, but rather a contrived fake outcome. Next. And it appears they blew, that those were blown by explosives. There was a group of some 200, a couple of dozen Israeli art students known as a gelatin group who were in the Twin Towers and had full access to the building. We have photographs of them with boxes of fuses, we'll see momentarily, who appear to have been there. They were doing performance art outside the buildings, but actually, I think, rigging the building in various ways, including to blow out those cutouts to make it look as though planes had actually hit the building. Next. Now here you see the intersection. There's 7 different floors for Flight 11. And remember, each of those floors represented an acre of concrete on a steel truss. No way it's possible that a real plane could have entered the North Tower or the South. Next. Here you see a more close-up. You can tell something is really wrong here with the way in which the steel is damaged. I mean, this is not from something that cut through. It's very, very hot. Next slide. And here, guess what? Edward Hendry, once again, he had the Bureau of Transportation Statistics record for Flight 11, showing no American airline Flight 11 was scheduled to depart Boston Logan on 9/11. So the Flight 11 and 77, those planes were not even in the air on 9/11. Next. And here, this is a photo from the gelatin group inside, and these are boxes of fuse holders. So they had access to the building, as I say. These were some of the 200 Mossad agents that were brought in as art students where the CIA approved their visas, which of course shows CIA, neocons, and Mossad were all instrumental in bringing us 9/11. Next. And here you have a whole lot of events that were going on in New York City at the time. Thank God the New York police were so good, so competent, because they were able to shut down what was actually intended to be a far more massive event. Next slide. The art students had a variety of tasks on 9/11, among them planting jammers on buildings to block Port Authority dispatchers and first responder radios, to plant explosives on the Jersey side of the George Washington Bridge where the cables are anchored in order to collapse the bridge, to explode a trunk in the Lincoln Tunnel, to explode a trunk in the Highland Tunnel. They were also going to bring down the Brooklyn Bridge. The whole plan, the master plan, was to isolate Manhattan as an island. And I think, gentlemen, today, this may be a good point for us to converse about what's happened here and have a part 2 a few days hence, if that would be your pleasure.
Yeah, no, that is brilliant. I'll email you for the next suggested date. But I think Tim just probably wants to add on to this show, and you're free to listen or go as you please. He wants to talk about the Amtrak's connection to 911. But before he does, a couple of things I've heard in the last few years. It's virtually impossible for the most experienced pilot to aim a plane at a building so precisely. So
Yes.
some of these people who were supposed to be terrorists, a couple of them, I believe, was just out of simulators. So how?
Yes. Let me talk about that. What we've lived back to just the three of us. Take off the slide set and for the benefit of the audience. But this was a very elaborate plan. No, you're completely 100% correct. Pilots for 9/11 Truth was challenged to see how difficult or easy it would be to hit a twin tower in a 767. And they performed repeated tests with multiple pilots. And none of them were able to hit the twin tower. It was just too difficult. With one exception, Rob Massamo, who was the head of pilots, was able to hit one of the twin towers one time when they tried to do it. So it was quite a feat of that was we want to return to us, gentlemen. Yeah. Oh, that is my blog, of course. There's just there are a lot of 9/11 stories there. But I think we want to come back to us. And then, as you say, the pilots, these alleged Islamic terrorists were incompetent at flying aircraft. As I've already mentioned, Hani Anjour was supposed to have piloted Flight 77 into the Pentagon, was performing a feat, a spiral descent that experienced pilots said they would have a very difficult time navigating. But yes, here we are in my blog, James H. Fetzer, Exposing Falsehood and Revealing Truths, James H. Fetzer with no period.org. Gentlemen,
there was one other little point from me, and then I'll let Tim finish with his anthrax, and then we can do part 2 of this another time. The other point, the autopilot, in 1947 or thereabouts, Second World War, I believe, America made it possible, in case of a terrorist attack, to take control of the planes. It was then revisited in the 80s and 90s, and some people say that's how they controlled the planes, by remote control. But
Andy, that was the original plan until they discovered it was physically impossible to get real planes into the buildings. They had to get the real planes into the building for them to explode inside the building to claim that the planes had been responsible for their collapse. Well, the planes weren't responsible for their collapse. In fact, they didn't even collapse. Building 7 collapsed. A collapse involves all the floors coming down at the same time, requiring the demolition of all the support columns simultaneously. And we had that with Building 7. With the Twin Towers, however, we had all the floors remaining stationary in position until, in the words of Morgan Reynolds, they were blown to kingdom come. And it was done by a very sophisticated technique I'll be explaining when we do our part 2, using a very powerful small nuclear device in the sub-basement, which blew the inner tube apart from the bottom up, and then had the residual effects of blowing the rest of the building apart from the top down. But you can see that required a tremendous source of energy, which turns out to be one of the proofs that this was not done by a directed energy weapon. It required some tremendous source of energy. A huge metal assembly was blown out of the Twin Tower into the Winter Garden, as I'll review when we continue. And when it was over, there was nothing there. It turns out that with controlled demolitions, you wind up with a residue of about 12% of the original height. And with Building 7, which is a 47-story building, that was 5.5 floors. Yeah, very good. Very good. Right. Scroll down. There you go. You see that cartoonish image, If you keep scrolling, we can see it even better. Yeah. 23 years later, still more evidence of fakery is emerging.
Yes.
Right, Tim, do you want to finish with the Amtraks, and we'll thank Jim for his contribution today.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so the anthrax false flag also blamed wrongfully and completely illegitimately on Al Qaeda, whom had nothing to do with it. The event was 9/11/01. Once again, the 9/11 numerals appearing in the dating of the letter that was sent in to one of the senators. Which senators? We're talking about Senator Leahy and Senator Daschle. Now,
Right.
I had
who wanted to hold hearings, about what had happened on 9/11. They were trying to rush through the Patriot Act, which would consolidate 35 separate agencies within the government into one mammoth agency. It was actually modeled after the East German Stasi, widely regarded as one of the most effective, most efficient secret police agencies the world has ever known. And we know from those who have reviewed the data that having small independent agencies competing to discover intelligence is a far more successful method for discovering the truth than to have one monolithic agency offering a single opinion. So when they consolidated the 35 agencies, it had the unexpected, undesirable effect of reducing, not enhancing, the intelligence capabilities of the United States. And of course, it had many other draconian features, such that now Representative Luna has introduced a bill that I support 100% of repealing the Patriot Act. That is the best possible thing that could be done in the wake of 9/11, because many of the adverse, the negative enduring effects of what occurred on that fateful day have been implemented by means of that draconian bill.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Hello.
Tim, continue. I see him, my friend.
Okay. Yeah, I had an RCMP officer attending my security course years ago, and I taught security guards to pass the ministry and test so that they could become security guards. So I gave them a course, and I've had students who took the course say that it was like a police foundations course because it was so thorough. And I had one student say that he learned more in 5 days than in his entire university degree of 4 years.
Love it, Tim.
Yeah. So anyway, the RCMP officer looked at the address and how it was written on these anthrax letters and envelopes that appeared on the FBI's website. And he said, no. The schools would not allow students to send out letters that were with handwritten addresses written on the envelopes by the students in the way that it's depicted in the envelopes that are shown on the FBI website.
Yeah. Even the envelopes were fake, were fabricated. Very nice, Tim. Very nice.
Yeah, and he said what the school would do is it would have its address typed on a stamp that would be attached to the left side of the envelope so that it looked neat and tidy and would represent the dignity of the institution. Well, they would not allow, the students to write the address of the school and send it to these politicians in Washington. It just wouldn't be done. The letters themselves strike anyone with common sense as being fabrications. You cannot stop us. We have this anthrax. You die now.
Yes.
Are,
Yes.
are
Yes.
you afraid?
Amateurish.
Oh,
Phony.
incredibly.
Yeah,
And
I
death
agree.
to America, death to Israel. Allah is great. Well,
Yeah.
I had Muslim students in my class, and they said no, they would never put Allah is great like that at the bottom of the letter. Allah would appear at the top of the letter, just
Yes.
because God doesn't go at the bottom of anything. It's always at the top. And they wouldn't say Allah is great. They'd say Allah Akbar, or
Yeah.
God is great.
Yes. Yes.
The
Yes.
dating is not the Arabic system of dating with day, month, year. But I think that you could argue that just for the sake of November the 9th, 2001, creating the 9/11 signature once again, they have ordered the date in such a fashion. So it's 09-11-01 as it appears on the top of the letter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole Amtrak thing was to rush the Patriot Act through Congress without any deliberation, and it was a sign that the government itself was fully, deeply implicated in 9/11, and this is why they had to steal the election in 2000 in Florida, where Jeb Bush was the governor with the hanging chads. They had to get Bush and Cheney into office so they could bring us 9/11. But it turns out that Cheney himself was the executive director on the ground in the United States from a bunker beneath the White House, as Michael Rupert established in his magisterial work, Crossing the Rubicon, where from publicly available sources, he established that role for our own vice president.
Yeah, that's a tremendously good book. I read it back at the time, and and of course, unfortunately, Mr. Rupert's no longer with us. Tragic occurrence involving his death after the release of his book. Okay. The other letter says this is next. Take penicillin now. Penicillin is misspelled. It's actually spelled Penacillin. It's quite conceivable that some CIA agent may not know how to spell penicillin, whereas an Arab terrorist from the Middle East would probably be able to spell better than the CIA agent. They wouldn't misspell a word that represents their organization, Al Qaeda. Their dignity is sacrosanct. They would not cast aspersions on their own organization as being ignorant buffoons by misspelling such an important English word. They would know. If they didn't know, they'd look it up and make sure that they had the spelling correct. I know Asian culture better than my own culture. I've spent half of my career in Asia, and I know how highly they value education. And something like a spelling mistake, even in a non-native language, would be so shameful in any of those Asian cultures. They wouldn't make a spelling mistake. That's just not on. No, it wouldn't happen. Perhaps if they were trying to implicate Al Qaeda, they might devise the letter in such a way as to make it look as if it was written by someone who is not terribly familiar with English. But if you know anything about Asian culture, you'll know that spelling is very important, and they wouldn't make that kind of mistake. As for the amateurish formation of the letters, ill-formed and so on, I would say that no, not if you're used to the advanced classes in calligraphy for writing in Arabic, Farsi, Chinese, or any of the Asian languages. You require great skill and dexterity with your penmanship in order to form the letters and the characters of your languages. And they would be able to do it so well that the Latin-based characters of the English language would be child's play, just so easy for them to form those letters, even if they weren't, accustomed to using the written language very much. They would be able to easily execute the lettering so that it was well done. I noticed that in the letter, there were certain letters that appeared to be more bold than other letters. And if you look those letters up in terms of their alphanumeric position in the English alphabet, they do show up in rather numerically interesting positions in the alphabet.
Yes.
So that's another point that needs to be investigated. I'm just trying to scroll down here. Yeah, so the address that ostensibly they were sent from is 4th grade, Greendale School, Franklin Park, New Jersey. I have also been shown by that same RCMP officer who attended my course that the postmarks appearing on the envelopes do not have the proper coding for the place from which they were supposed to have been sent. The coding is wrong.
That's just terrific stuff, Tim. Actually, wonderful expose. Virtually every aspect of 9/11 was fraudulent. I can't think of a major aspect. If you think of it as a theory floating in space, linked to the world by chains of evidence, like the cell phone calls, the plane crash sites, the alleged perpetrators, the effects on the ground, and so forth, none of them turn out to be accurate or authentic as reported to us by the 9/11 Commission. It was a glorious whitewash. And
Indeed.
as I explained during our subsequent conversation, I believe there's a good reason. Because the fellow who they put in charge of the 9/11 Commission, I believe, was a fellow who wrote the script.
Yeah. The alleged conversations between passengers and relatives or friends on the ground are completely fabricated, quite obviously. I mean, you're not going to call your mother and identify yourself by your first name. She'll know you immediately by your voice, and you will not have to announce the name of the caller, to your own mother.
Yeah. Mom, Mom, it's your son. Ridiculous. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And even Barbara Olson, is supposed to have been on Flight 77. Turns out she immediately went to Europe and she was actually arrested in some financial problem on the Swiss-Austrian border. And she underwent cosmetic surgery, a facelift, and came back under the name of Lady Booth to remarry her husband, Ted Olson, who was the Solicitor General of the Bush admin. I mean, the extent of the fraud is mind-boggling.
Astounding. Yeah, I know. It's just amazing. And apparently at that height and at that speed, a cell phone would not even be operative.
Yes. A.K. Dudney was a professor of computer science at Western Ontario. Took 3 different types of cell phones and made several flights and discovered at speeds over 200 miles an hour, altitudes above 2,000 feet, the relay towers can't switch to keep the communication going. So all the cell phones were fabricated in advance. And there are clues there, if you listen to them very carefully, that this is artificial, not real. But most Americans, just can take for granted, oh, they even have cell phone calls, from the passengers, which again, it's like the plane disappearing into the building. It's an aeronautical impossibility. You have cell phone calls that were not possible again in terms of communication ability at the time. Just one impossibility after another. Eventually you catch on. If they're telling us events that are impossible, they cannot be telling the truth.
Yeah, it's just amazing. I'm so glad that we had this show today, because you've pointed out things that I had not known in my research, and it seems back in the day that a lot of the evidence that you've raised today wasn't even available back nearer to the date of the event.
Well, I had the advantage in 2005 of founding scholars, and I brought together experts from all over the world. I mean, we had 600 to 800 members of scholars by the end of 2006 when we were getting too close to the truth, and there was an internal sabotage movement to break the society apart. Even while I was in Greece, giving what turned out to be a 3.5-hour internationally broadcast by satellite presentation with a panel of 12. Going in, they said, oh, only 2 or 3 will ask. I said, not tonight. And I was right. All 12 asked questions. They had these wonderful clips from 9/11 to use. It was just a sensational show. It was hosted by the leading muckraker in Greece, who'd been responsible for bringing down previous corrupt Greek governments. And he extended the show by an extra half hour because there was so much going on there. It was probably, one of the very best world-class presentations I ever had the opportunity to present. The circumstance was just perfect. All expense paid flight to Athens for me and my wife. I mean, it was just wonderful. And of course, for a philosopher to be in Athens, birthplace of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, what a sensation.
Right. Wow. That's a tremendous experience for you. Yeah. I also studied classical philosophy at Trent University, and I had a wonderful philosophy professor named Marion Fry, who was like a female version of Socrates. And it was wonderful to be in those tutorials and doing the Platonic dialogues.
Wonderful.